Our speaker today is Judge Clarence Seeliger. Judge Seeliger is well known for his involvement in civil rights as well as protection of victims of domestic violence. He is currently a DeKalb County Superior Court judge in the Stone Mountain Judicial Circuit. He has handled matters seen in any Superior Court, including serious criminal matters, domestic relations, and other major cases. Born in Seattle, Washington in 1940, Seeliger holds an undergraduate degree from the University of Washington. He served in the United States Air Force from 1963 to 1967 and was captain upon his release from service. He holds a law degree from Emory University Law School and was admitted to the bar in 1970. He is married to the former Gwen Pagler, and they have 2 daughters and grandchildren. I don't know how many grandchildren. He has been honored over the years for his work in civil rights and against domestic violence. Will you please join me in welcoming Judge Clarence Seeliger to the podium.
Well, I'm going to talk today. It's more of a, there was a difference between a biography and a memoir. This is a memoir. This is not, so don't hold me to it. I may get some of my facts wrong, and there are a lot of people in this room who probably remember the facts better than I do. So please be kind when you comment about it. I guess it is my story, so I'm going to talk a little bit about me, and then I'm going to start talking about what happened in DeKalb County in the 1980s, and then a little bit about the Presidential Parkway, which I presided in for a full 5 years. I was born in Seattle in 1940, graduated from high school in '58, Cleveland High School, University of Washington in 1963, and did enter the Air Force in 1963. I stayed in the service for 4.5 years. 2 things happened while I was in the Air Force. Excuse me. First, I met Gwen, who would be my wife. We've been married now for 43 years. But Gwen was an engineer working at a refractory plant in Pascagoula, Mississippi. I was in Biloxi, Mississippi, receiving training as a communications officer. We stayed in contact for almost 5 years, and finally, when she was sure I was going to graduate from law school, she decided she would marry me. I had a proposal on the table for almost 3 years, but finally she made up her mind. The other thing that happened while I was in the service was Vietnam. I volunteered for duty in Vietnam and Thailand. I was not a combat veteran. I did not go out and shoot people, nor was I shot at. I worked as a communications officer at air bases in Thailand and in Vietnam. My starkest memory is that when I was stationed at Tak Le, there was a unit that was bombing Hanoi. They was flying F-105s and F-4s. They had 23 aircraft in that particular tactical fighter wing. They were there in a reflex action. They were from Kandina, the Air Force Base in Okinawa. They had arrived for 120 days. When they left in 1963, after 120 days, there were 3 pilots left. The losses that our fighter pilots suffered in bombing Hanoi I've never really talked about, but my guess is, especially in those early years when I was there in 1965, the losses were anywhere from 80 to 90%. That had an effect on me emotionally. I originally got into the Air Force with the idea that I would get out and become a postulant for holy orders in the Episcopal Church. I gave that up, and then I decided I wanted to go to law school. Now, how did I get to Atlanta? Well, of course, the biggest reason was, of course, Gwen. Gwen was working here. She was an engineer. She went to work on the space program, and then later she would go to work at Lockheed as a systems testing engineer, and so that was one of the first reasons. Second reason, I wanted to get into a good law school, and I don't know how I did it, but somehow I got admitted into Emory Law School, so that worked out well. And the third reason was that I wanted to be involved in the civil rights movement. It was the tail end of the civil rights movement. It was about 1967 and 68. I started law school in 1967, and I ran into a young man by the name of Maynard Jackson. Maynard was teaching poverty law at Emory University that year and running the clinic, and we got to be pretty good friends. And then that summer, I started with the Southern Regional Council, which some of you may remember. It's now a defunct organization, but it was an organization that did research on race relations in the South. It was sponsored by the Methodist Church, the Field Foundation, and the Ford Foundation, and the project that was, which was their operating in their major emphasis, was registering African Americans to vote. You may recall 2 years earlier, in 1965, the Civil Rights Act was passed, the Voting Rights Act was passed, and thousands of African Americans, for the first time, were getting the opportunity to vote. When I came, one day as I was coming in to the Southern Regional Council, who should show up but Maynard. And Maynard asked me, Chuck, I'm going to run against Herman Talmadge for the United States Senate. I said, you are? And he said, would you help? And I said, well, let me think about it. I then talked to the people at the Southern Regional Council, and they said, yeah, go ahead. Exactly what we want. We want to support an African-American candidate. Maynard was the first African-American to run statewide since Reconstruction, and to see if he could do about drawing develop and have the voting for African-Americans. That was the whole idea of his race. And I served as I did some advancement work with him. I also did a lot of statistical workups on the campaign on a part-time basis. At the end of the campaign, of course, he lost. He got 24% of the vote, but significantly, a large proportion of that vote was African American. And so for the first time after that, the African American community started to play a major role in the politics of Georgia. In 1969, he would run for vice mayor, and I worked on that campaign part-time. He wanted to hire me, but I was in law school, and I said I'd only do it part-time, which I did. And he was successful. He won. 4 years later, he would run for mayor, and did a few things on that campaign, but not much. I was too busy starting my own law practice in Decatur, so I couldn't really help him all that much. But Maynard and I stayed fairly close. We'd see each other maybe about once every 2 years or so. I'd go down and have breakfast with him when he was a vice mayor, and once or twice when he was mayor. But then we lost contact because, as I say, I was starting my practice in DeKalb County. In 1976, I got a call from Bill Brennan from the Legal Aid Society. Bill called and said he had a client by the name of Brenda White. Brenda was an African-American woman, single, 2 children, and a grandmother she was taking care of, and she was charged with welfare fraud. It was the first time anyone was prosecuted in the state of Georgia for welfare fraud. The law had been passed just that year. I agreed to do it. And I asked Mary Whiteman to help me out. Mary was sharing office space over at the old Masonic Temple building across the street. Well, I had to go off to Seattle to visit, take care of some family business, but when I got back, Mary, who had done the investigation, came up and said, Chuck, they've got her. All the evidence is she signed several affidavits saying that she'd lied about her income. It seems that she'd been working in a barbecue shack and reporting that as her income, and she was getting a DFAX supplement, about $100 a month. She decided, but when she got a new job working at the Georgia Retardation Center up in Dunwoody, she did not report the increase in her salary. I understood why. She was desperate. She wasn't getting any child support from the father of her 2 kids, and she was taking care of her elderly grandmother and herself, and she really needed the money. But it was wrong, in violation of the law. So we decided we had to enter a plea. And so Mary and I, with Brenda, went over to the state court in front of a fellow by the name of J. Oscar Mitchell. I think most of you know J. Oscar Mitchell. J. Oscar Mitchell is the man who put Martin Luther King in jail on a traffic violation in 1960, causing the Kennedy campaign to be involved, who reluctantly granted him, after putting him in Reedsville, not yet, excuse me, granted him a bond. Now, the reason why Dr. King was going to Reedsville is because he had come over to DeKalb County, and DeKalb County is alien country for African Americans at that time. He was arrested by the police for driving with an Alabama driver's license. He was then before Judge Mitchell, and Judge Mitchell accepted a plea to $25 fine, and you're on, quote, probation. Then Dr. King then left to go down to the Britches because they were the kids from Morehouse, from Spelman and the other schools in that complex decided were doing demonstrations at Rich's to see if they could get seating at the Magnolia Room at Rich's. And Dr. King, being in town, decided he would participate. And he was arrested, along with the rest of them, charged with criminal trespass. When Judge Mitchell discovered that, he ordered Dr. King back to DeKalb County, and he revoked his probation for 6 months and ordered him to be sent to Reedsville Penitentiary. And that's the time when the Kennedy campaign came in and intervened. And he finally got him an appeals bond. J. Oscar Mitchell had a bad reputation for abusing people, especially African Americans who didn't have lawyers at that time. So that was the judge we were going to see. We tendered our plea in front of Judge Mitchell, then Judge Mitchell started talking. And he started talking very rough. Well, welfare fraud people here. He used just about every epithet you can possibly think of as far as people who are on either receiving welfare benefits and the like. He used every possible word you could think of except the word, and forgive me for using it, nigger. That went on for almost 90 seconds rather. I turned and looked at Brenda. Brenda was in tears and shaking. And then I looked back at Judge Mitchell and he looked at me, and something passed between us. I'm not exactly sure what. But Mary took charge, as she often did, and said, "Come on, Brenda, let's go to probation and work this out." She had entered a plea to probation to pay the restitution. The total amount she got from the state of Georgia was $600. I sat out in the hallway outside the courtroom wondering what had happened. I did not really understand what Judge Mitchell had done. And then a fellow by the name of Joe Ledley walked up. He's a reporter from the Atlanta Journal. He's now retired. He said, and I knew him, and I said, "Joe, what are you doing here?" And so I was called by Judge Mitchell because he wanted to make a statement about welfare fraud and prosecution of welfare fraud. He said, "You were called by the judge?" And he said, "Yeah." And so all of a sudden it came to me. He had run over my client in order to make a political point, and I was mad as hell. I did not know what I was going to do that day, but I started to think very, very hard, and 4 years later, I would announce I was running against him for judge of the state court. It was not going to be an easy campaign because there were several things stacked against me. Number one, of course, Judge Mitchell had been a judge for 30 years. He had, secondly, he had the support of the Bar Association. The bar did a poll, and based on that poll, by a vote of about 80-some to 20%, they said I was either the lawyers did not know me, or I was not qualified. And there were a lot of people I knew in practicing in Decatur who went to law school with me, and they supported Oscar Mitchell. It's one of those things you run into in politics. That kind of, you don't count on loyalty when you're running against an incumbent judge. And finally, last but not least, it was in a Democratic primary, and the leaders of the Democratic Party, Manuel Maloof, who was running for chair of the county commission, announced their support for Oscar. Walt Russell, who was then chair of the county commission, also supported him, and a newly elected sheriff by the name of Pat Jarvis also endorsed him. There was not a lot of people thinking I had a chance of winning, but I had some things going for me. And basically, it was a group of young lawyers, excuse me, who worked on my campaign, and some of them are here today. There was Wayne Purdom and Susan Ellis. They helped run the campaign. They had been involved with Oscar before. They decided they would support me in my campaign. There was Ron Jason, who was the titular chairman of the campaign, but he did the most creative thing he did was write most of the brochures, the signs, and a lot of the press releases that we used in the campaign. He was brilliant. There was Rob Walter. Walter was a law student who finished law school, and he's now a juvenile court judge up in Gwinnett County. There were good friends, Byron Wyndham, who's now practicing up in North Georgia, and there were a young couple, Henry and Marita Johnson, who were working on the campaign. Of course, Henry's now known as Hank, and he's our congressman from the 4th Congressional District. And there was Nesby Thomas, who is here today. He would figure in my career later on, but he was also working on the campaign. He was the father of Dwight Thomas, a good lawyer who was running office space for me, and he helped. And finally, Bob Leach. He was involved in the campaign on a kind of a small-time basis in 1980, but in 1984, he would become my finance chairman when I ran for the Superior Court. The second thing I had going for me were endorsements from the Atlanta Journal and the Atlanta Constitution. At that time, they were two separate newspapers, but each one of them offered an endorsement for me, and that was something that helped a lot. And finally, unknown to me, something had happened that I did not know about. A fellow by the name of Maynard Jackson, who was then mayor of the city of Atlanta, he quietly worked on the campaign. He never told me that he was supporting me in the campaign. But he had lived in DeKalb County for some years before he moved to Atlanta to run for political office. And he quietly put the word out that I was in fact a good candidate among the African American community. That carried a lot of weight. He also put out a ticket, a ticket that listed campaigns he supported, and my name was at the top of that ticket. I didn't find out about it until after the campaign was over. With all of that going, the campaign was going to be kind of rough, but we decided we'd do two things. We emphasized three things in the campaign. Number one, we'd talk about his reversal rate. Ron Jason had done the research work on that and found out that Judge Mitchell got it reversed 41% of the time. Secondly, we talked about the fact that he disposed of criminal cases behind closed doors. Lawyers with defendants on DUI cases would go to the solicitor's office and then go see, and they would say, which judge would you want to see? And then go see the judge in chambers. The plea was entered there. Usually the plea might be reduced from from DUI, which costs people's licenses, down to public drunk, and then they pay a fine. But importantly, they would save their license. All this happened beyond closed doors. And finally, last, the abuse of people in court. Oscar was rough on people, lots of people. I still remember one story. There's a lady by the name of Sherry Sutton, which I think some of you know. I forgot, she was married sometimes, I've forgotten her husband, what's that? Schulman, yeah, Sherry Schulman. And I ran into her at Manuel's because even though Manuel had told me that he wasn't supporting me, he still took my beer money. And I was sitting there, and Sherry came up to me, and she was a graduate student at Emory. And Sherry said, look, Chuck, you don't want to run. I talked to Manuel, you just don't want to run. I said, it's too dangerous, you're going to ruin your career. I'd heard that a dozen times. So I said, no, Sherry, I'm running against Oscar Mitchell. And then we left. She left, and I left. About 3 weeks later, she called me and said, are you still running against Oscar Mitchell? I said, yes, I am. I'm going to send you some money. Why? I was called for jury duty last week, and I saw Oscar Mitchell up close. I'll send you some money. So, the election had a primary. There was really a nice guy by the name of Jim Goggins who was running for the third seat. To this day, I don't know why Jim was in the race in the Democratic primary. But he ran, and he's a very nice guy. But he didn't really campaign all that hard, but he was a factor because on primary night, Judge Mitchell got 46% of the vote, I got 43% of the vote, and the rest went to Jim Goggins. Now this was very bad news for Judge Mitchell. The reason why it was bad news, because in primaries, usually the incumbent's going to get all the votes he's going to get. The other vote, usually the vote of the challenger who didn't make it to the primary, make it to the runoff, usually turns votes in favor of the challenger. And Judge Mitchell started a campaign. He took it pretty lightly when I was running before, but now he knew he was in trouble. And he spent $75,000 very quickly, raising it from the lawyers in the area, doing television, direct mail, and the like, but it was too late. Because on the runoff night, I won by 55% of the vote. Now, I want to be very clear on this. When I ran against Oscar Mitchell, it wasn't because I wanted to be a judge. I was just mad as hell at him. I wanted him to be gone. So when I was driving home with my wife in the car, I said, honey, I'm glad I beat Oscar. That's what I wanted to do. But I don't know if I want to be a judge. And she just gave me one of those looks that wives can give husbands at that time. And I said, well, it's a little late for that. I said, yes, dear. And so we went on home. And I believe the people who supported me at that time in 1980 thought I was a nice guy. They had no idea whether I'd be a good judge or not. They supported me because they shared my sentiment about Judge Mitchell. They supported me, and that's how I won. Probably the biggest surprise to me, and I've never talked to Wayne or Ron about this, but was we did not know what the Republicans were going to do. Because this was a Democratic primary and there was a Republican primary, but as I recall, there was nobody really running in the Republican primary that had a contested race. So we just didn't know what they were going to do. We did campaign a lot in North DeKalb County and East DeKalb County, largely Republican strongholds, but we weren't really sure. And when I looked at the figures, I came to the conclusion large numbers of Republicans did vote in the Democratic primary and gave me a lot of the votes that caused me to win. So I've always been kind of grateful to Republicans for the most part, not recently, but in the past. And because at that time they were interested in judicial reform as well. Okay, now, I'm about to become a judge of the state court. Well, of course, the first thing I would do was hire Beverly Alex, who'd been my secretary, to work for me. Then the next step was really who should be my bailiff. Now, DeKalb County at that time in 1980, there were no African Americans in the DA's office, no African Americans in the Superior Court Clerk's office. There was one African American in the Public Defender's office, a small office just starting, that was Mike Hancock. There were no African Americans working in the Marshal's office in the state court. But Judge Mitchell had hired one black person in the state court, but that's all, and he always concealed her in the back so that she wouldn't be noticed by everyone else. Aside from that, this was an all-white county. The judges were all male and all white. That was at DeKalb County in 1980. So when I looked around for a bailiff, Nesby Thomas approached me. You know, he had worked on my campaign, and he said, Chuck, how about, I'd like to be your bailiff, how about that? And I thought, and he's here today, and I thought, boy, wouldn't that be great? Nesby is a tall, dignified-looking African-American, and I appointed him, and he became the first African-American in the state court in a public position, that is, as a bailiff. And I believe the first full-time bailiff hired in the entire state court of the Superior Court. I also, at that time, also talked to the other judges about it after Oscar was gone, and they all agreed. It's time African Americans were made a part of the judicial fabric of our county. And to Judge Smith's credit and to Judge Carlisle's credit, by 1984, 20% of the employees were African American in the state court. Why is that important? Well, these were people who were well qualified, but didn't have a chance for a job because Oscar would not allow them to be hired. With Oscar gone, these judges made sure that well-qualified African Americans got the job, and they did wonderful work. Most of them are now retired. I think about that. I'm still working. They're all retired, and doing very well. But they were wonderful and continue to be a great force in our county. Now, one day after I'd been elected and had been sworn in, I wandered into the courtroom and I noticed over in the corner, I was still in the daze. I mean, me, a judge, I couldn't believe it. But anyway, I walked into the courtroom and looked over to the left, and there was 2 flags over there. I thought, what am I doing with 2 state flags? Now, this is when the state flag had stars and bars on it, as well as a Georgia seal. I thought, well, what am I doing with 2 flags? So I wandered over and looked at it, and I realized one of them was a Confederate flag, and I found out later it belonged to Judge Mitchell. Judge used to drape it over the entrance to his courtroom on Confederate Memorial Day and on Robert E. Lee's birthday. Now, I'm not sure which courtroom it was, whether it was a small courtroom he used, it's in the other end of this courthouse, or down at the one that was destroyed in order to build the Callaway building. I don't know where he had it, but that's where it was, but somehow he left it in my courtroom. I didn't quite know what to do about that, so I went home that night and I thought about it. Well, I think I'm going to remove that thing. So as I was coming into the courthouse, I ran into another reporter. His name was Bo Spalding. I told Bo about the flag, and I said I was going to remove it. And he said, well, that's not much of a story. And he said, well, yeah, I don't think it is either, but do you want to do something on it? He says, well, I'll talk to my editor. So he called the editor and said, okay, we'll do a story. It won't be maybe a couple paragraphs. So I said, that's fine. Just want to send a record out there that DeKalb County is changing. So that morning on a arraignment calendar, I came out on the bench and I just simply said, the Confederate flag used to be a flag of honor. Now it's come to represent an attitude toward race and ought not to be in any courtroom. I'm asking my bailiff, Nesby Thomas, African American, to remove the flag, which he did. And then we continued on with the arraignment. Bo came back later and he said, that's what you said? And I said, that's all I said. And he said, well, I'll do a short piece with it. I'm going off to Canada. So he did. That afternoon, about 1 o'clock, as I was coming out of my courtroom, I ran into this young black man. And he had three cameras on him. So being the sharp legal mind that I am, he must be a photographer. So I asked him about it, and he came up to me and said, are you Judge Seeliger? And I said, yes, I am. I took some pictures of your bailiff with the flag. Do you mind? I said, no. That's all right. Couldn't figure out for a 3-inch story why you do a thing like that. And then he turned and looked at me, and I swear to God I saw a tear in his eye, and he said, thank you. That's when I realized that this case was going to be, this issue might be something, and it might be more than I thought. And sure enough, the next afternoon paper, the Atlanta Journal headline, front page, top block, new DeKalb judge banishes Confederate flag. Complete with a picture of Nesby Thomas, my bailiff, holding the flag. Well, I didn't know quite what to make of it. I got a few phone calls. A couple of friends of mine who kind of read the journal from time to time called and said, hey, it's a good move, Chuck, don't worry about it. And I said, I won't. But then the next morning, all hell broke loose. The calls started, and I started to receive mail, and it wasn't pleasant mail. One was a death threat, but the reason the death threat came, it was from Spokane, because the day after that article was published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, B.J. Stoner, who you may recall was it JB or BJ, I think, I've forgotten which one, but he was head of he was publisher of The Lightning, which is a racist newspaper published in Marietta. And he put my picture, put Nesby's picture with the flag, and underneath it, my name, my home telephone number, and my home address, and sent it out to every racist organization in the country. And so the racist statements kept coming and coming and coming. I got a file about this big of them. They started calling in the middle of the night. My wife got a little tired of it. She says, when they called at 2 o'clock in the morning and said they wanted to talk to me, she would tell me, here, it's one of your friends. So I picked up, and it'd be somebody making some sort of racist step that I finally just hung up on them. Because most of the time, no, they would never tell her their names, and frankly, I don't have any respect for anyone who won't identify themselves. This is, of course, before caller ID. And finally, it tailed off. And then something else happened with that. I will tell the story. It's quite old because this is when I was in the Superior Court. 18 years later, I get a call from my wife from home. And she says, Chuck, the Secret Service are here. What? They're at our door. They want to search our house. I said, well, does he have a warrant? I said, I don't think so. Well, put him on the line. So I told him, he got online and said, this is Judge Seeliger. And he said, you're a judge? And I said, yes, I'm a judge. And well, how do I know you're a judge? Well, here's my telephone number. Call my office and let my secretary answer it. He did that. And then he said, well, I guess you are a judge. And said, yes, I am a judge. Why are you here? He says, well, we received communication from somebody that said that you had dynamite in your basement and you were going to blow up President Clinton. And I had to laugh because I said, from where I live, I may be the only person who voted for President Clinton within a quarter mile. So I just let it go at that and said, why are you doing this? And he said, well, we just got this information. And I said, well, have you got involved in anything? Oh, yeah, some years ago I removed a Confederate battle flag and I got a lot of hate mail. Well, do you have some of that mail? I said, well, here at the office, I got a lot of hate mail most recently, about 6 months ago. This little old lady, I'm sure she was, I don't know if she was or not, had a Royal Corona typewriter, and she typed out these notes. putting pictures from Playboy or Penthouse, or and kind of a jargon, really racist stuff about saying that I had an African-American child and why don't you recognize me and all of that. Gwen kind of asked me about that, and I said, no, Gwen, it's not true. But they kept sending it. I kept getting it every 3 or 4 months, every 3 months or so. We just throw it away till the last one. And then Gwen said, well, I do have one. And I said, you do? Well, give it to him. And so we gave it to him, and he said, okay, we'll take this, and we'll look into it. About 2 months later, I get a call from this gentleman. He said, well, Judge, we found out who was sending that stuff, and it is the same person that warned us about you bombing President Clinton. And I said, well, and he said, yeah, well, why are you calling me? And he said, well, what do you want to do about it? We don't necessarily want to put this person in jail. And I said, well, I don't care as long as she doesn't send me that damn mail anymore. And he said, we'll take care of it. And that's the last I heard of it. Then that's about most of the excitement we had while I was in the state court. But 1980 to 1984 were big times of change. Hilton Fuller was elected in 1980, the same time I was to the Superior Court, at the same time I was elected to the state court. He would go on to be chair of our delegation, but also president of the Council of Superior Court Judges. And he's responsible for one of the major improvements for our courts. He helped found and put together the language and the information on the Dispute Resolution Center, which is across the street. It allows people who are involved in civil litigation to sit down with a mediator and see if it can be settled at no cost for at least 2 or 3 hours. It's been a great boon for the Superior Court. State Court hasn't used it as much, and the Magistrate Court does use it sometimes, but it's been a great boon for our, and that could not have happened without Hilton. Also elected at the same time was a young man by the name of Bob Wilson. The district attorney's office was in real trouble. Randall Peak was its predecessor, but it was disorganized and there were cases being dismissed right and left because cases were not being prosecuted. And Bob won, and he did the changes and reforms and made the district attorney's office in DeKalb County, as it is still today, one of the finest in the state. And then there was Whit Smith. His only defect was that he was a Republican, and he won clerk of the state court, clerk of the Superior Court, and he instituted a lot of major changes and reforms that have been overlooked over the years. In 1982, Dan Corsi was elected, and he too also served as president of the state court, the Superior Court Council of Superior Court Judges, and it still continues to be on the bench as I do. And there were others. In 1982, although I chastised him a lot, Manuel Maloof, Manuel did a good thing. He appointed the first African-American full-time judge in the county, and that was Mike Hancock as Recorder's Court judge. He would serve there for about 6 years, and then later he'd be elevated to the Superior Court. In 1994, Bob Castellani was elected. He was appointed, I think, by Zell Miller and then re-elected. He instituted all kinds of reforms, but the greatest reform was when he put together, in his last year serving on the Superior Court bench, drug court. DeKalb County had the first really effective drug court in the state, largely to his leadership. And even now, though he's retired and teaching over at Emory, he still does his work with the drug court because he believes this important court that deals with offenders, non-violent offenders, and people who are not drug traffickers but are addicts can turn their lives around, and the drug court does that. And finally, there was Wayne Purdom. Wayne Purdom, in 1984, there was a constitutional amendment passed in 1983. In 1984, we had a new position called magistrate. It was replacing other magistrates' position, as well as the JPs, which had lots of scandals surrounding them over the years. And he took it over and created a brand new office and made the Magistrates Court, as it continues to be today, one of the best. And now he serves as Chief Judge of the State Court. And then women. When I left the state court to run for Superior Court, Ann Workland ran for my position as a judge of the state court. At the same time I was running for Superior Court, Carol Henstein was running for an open seat against 5 other men. Both of them won. They were the first women to be elected to a judicial position in DeKalb County in history. And of course, Carol is now a Chief Justice of our Georgia Supreme Court, and sadly retired about 2 years ago and then passed away from cancer. It was a great loss to all of us. And finally, Greg Adams. Greg Adams was appointed by the Superior Court to be the first African-American juvenile court judge. The juvenile court had been a scandal. It was not well organized and was not doing well. We sent him, because we knew he could be a tough guy, he was a former district attorney, to try to straighten everything out. He did it, and he did it well. So well, in fact, that the juvenile court is now named after him. That new courthouse is called the Greg Adams Courthouse because of the contributions he made. He's now serving on the Superior Court as well. And then in 1984, I was going to run against Clyde Henley. The reason I was going to run against Clyde Henley is fairly straightforward. I finally decided I liked being a judge, and I'd like to be a Superior Court judge. Clyde Henley, when I ran at the state court, put the word out that once I lost to Oscar, that I wouldn't be practicing in DeKalb County anymore. And he meant it. So when I was thinking about running for Superior Court judge, I looked at the various people who were up for re-election in 1984, and there was Clyde Henley. So I announced that I would run against him. Well, Clyde Henley decided to retire, and now there was an open seat, and a bright young man by the name of Brian Cavan would run. And so the two of us would run together again for that open seat. Brian was very bright. He was president of the Decatur-DeKalb Bar Association and worked with me. We worked together on the DeKalb Volunteer Lawyers Foundation back in the early 1980s. But he really didn't have much of a chance, I'm afraid. I won the election by 66% of the vote. But Brian is a real quality guy. The morning after the election, I walked into my office, Beverly handed me a note, and it was a note written by Brian. And Brian said, "Congratulations, Chuck, on winning the election. You'll be happy to know I'm not going to ask for a recount." And he said, "But I'm off to Panama City with my family. Congratulations again." Classy man. And of course, Brian then went to Buckhead, started making money as a lawyer and doing very, very well. He still lives in DeKalb and is involved with the Decatur-DeKalb Bar. But he was recently, 2 years ago, served as president of the State Court of DeKalb County. Not state courts, the State Bar, excuse me. He was president of the State Bar for the state of Georgia. And he did a wonderful job there. Well, that's about the end of the story as far as the 1980s are concerned. Lots of changes took place. But a lot of people are probably here because they're interested in about the Presidential Parkway. And that's kind of a story. How much time do I have? I've got 10 minutes, so I hope it'll cover it. I think most of you know the story of the Presidential Parkway before 1985. The Department of Transportation wanted to build I-485. In 485, it was a major freeway running from downtown Atlanta through Inman Park, through the parks in that area, Canada Park, through Decatur, into the link up with the Stone Mountain Expressway. And they got started with it, and they wiped out a huge splotch of land on the Atlanta side of Moreland Avenue. But then at that point, the issue became so political that President Carter, not President, but Governor Carter, under the instances of Burt Lance, who was then head of the DOT, Department of Transportation, stopped the building of the parkway. So we had this long fallow piece of land running from downtown Atlanta up to Moreland Avenue, and a few pieces on the other side of Moreland in DeKalb County. Of course, Jimmy Carter would then run for president, serve for 4 years, and then be defeated. And he would come back, and he made an agreement, the details of which I've never really known, between himself, Emory University, and the Department of Transportation to use that swatch of land that was dedicated for I-485 to build his library, the Presidential Library, and the Presidential Parkway. And the parkway was designed to go from downtown Atlanta up through that area where I-485 was once located, to cross from Moreland Avenue and swing on to Ponce de Leon. Of course, the neighbors all got really angry at Canada Park and Druid Hills and the like, and they would form an organization called Caution to challenge that. The first fights took place in federal court. I know very little about it. I think it was something about an environmental impact statement. The next battle took place in Fulton County Superior Court because a vote was taken to transfer the parks, that's Candler Park and Ormwood Park and I think another park, portion of the park, to the Department of Transportation to build a freeway. And the vote was taken, the vote was one vote, I think it was 13 to 12, and the deciding vote was cast by the Vice Mayor, Marvin Arrington. That was appealed. And it was appealed on it was decided, and then the suit was filed before Judge Osgood Williams. And Judge Williams concluded that there was a conflict of interest for Marvin Arrington to serve on it because it turns out he owns a subcontractor to Shepherd Construction who was building the parkway. And so he thought that was enough to stop the building of the parkway because he had a conflict of interest. He couldn't cast a fair and non-conflicted vote before the commission, before the city council. They also made a finding that Shepherd Construction had been convicted of a crime in negotiating certain contracts, the only time a corporation's ever been hit for that. And so therefore they could not be contracted with the state. It went to the court, it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court reversed. It said that Marvin Arrington didn't have a conflict of interest, so he could go ahead and vote, and reversed Shepherd, saying Shepherd could be the contractor. And it was sent back to the city council in 1984, and they voted on it. And again, they voted in favor of transferring those parks to the DOT so the freeway could be built. In 1985, January, I was elected. About May of that year, there were lots of things that were going on. There were demonstrations going on against the DOT. You may recall lots of people being arrested, people chaining themselves to trees, all kinds of different demonstrations to try to stop the building of the parkway. Then a lawsuit was filed after that vote was taken. The Department of Transportation decided they wanted to condemn the property. So they filed a condemnation notice in DeKalb County Superior Court. It went to Judge Castellani. Judge Castellani had to recuse himself because his son Mark was going to Padilla and had been demonstrating against the parkway, like all the other students at Padilla. So he felt it'd be a conflict of interest that he keep the case. So it went back to the wheel, it was signed to me. That's how I got the parkway. I still remember when the file was brought to me. It said from Judge Castellani, and I looked at it and said, oh my Lord, it is the presidential parkway. I didn't think too much about it. Then about 2 weeks later, Bill Joy from the Attorney General's office came in. He was another classmate of mine from Emory, and said, we want to condemn this property. And we want to do a quick take statute and take this property. We'll put the money into the registry of the court. It was authorized if you could get a judge to sign it. I told him I would not sign it. It has to be heard from all sides. So I said, we'll set down a hearing, and I want everybody to be notified. I got my law clerk to notify the city of Atlanta, Caution, all the other interested parties, DeKalb County Legal Department, any of the developers who want, any of the people who are building to come to court at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. I still remember walking out in that courtroom. The place was jammed, full of people standing all along the walls, sitting in their chairs and all along the walls, and nobody smiled. Man. So I walked in and I asked to be heard. I asked the parties to give me a preliminary argument. They did, and I said, all right, I want briefs on each side. Give me the briefs of why you think the caution, I know you're going to want to file a brief as to why I should not grant the condemnation. And I know the Department of Transportation wants to file a brief as to why I should grant it, so file it. And send it to me, and then we'll set it down for hearing. They did. The work was really good legally. They set it down for a hearing, and we had a 3-day hearing about what's to be done. I took it under advisement, which meant I read the briefs again and talked to my law clerk about it, and we started devising an order. While doing the research, I came across something, and this is something that's kind of debated, because some of the lawyers say they brought this up to me. I don't remember this, but this particular issue I thought I discovered myself by reading the statute. The first issue was, could they transfer the property? Could the city of Atlanta transfer the property? And second, even if they couldn't, could the Department of Transportation condemn it? Well, the first vote that was taken, the first issue was brought before me. When I reviewed the trees, it became clear to me that the city could not transfer the property. Why? These parks are being actively used, and the only way you can transfer a park that's been donated to the city for purposes of being a park is to have it abandoned. And these parks were not abandoned. As a factual basis, they were being used every day. So the city really had no authority to transfer the property. If they wanted to transfer it, they had to transfer it back to the original donators of the property, which was back in the 1920s. So I said, there's no way that could be transferred. But then the DOT said, we can convict, that we can take this car, we can condemn it. And I looked at it, and it looked like they were right. But then I noticed one little part of the statute. The statute kept saying condemning private property. It didn't say anything about condemning public property, which these parks were. And so I said, so at that point I ruled that I would deny the right to condemn because they simply could not take the property because they didn't have a legal statute to back them up. There was no statute that they could do it. And I presented that order and all hell broke loose. I was called everything under the sun. My people, Andy Young had a press conference, told me what he thought of me. The developers did the same thing. Every politician in a stroke that was in favor of building the parkway had something to say about it. And Caution was really happy, so they had a party. They didn't invite me. It was a party somewhere down on, well, where the parks are now located, the so-called, you know, the developer, I've forgotten his name, the guy who designed those parks down there. Yeah, that's right. And so they had a party, and I wasn't invited, so that was fine with me. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court looked at it, and much to the shock of everyone, my decision was upheld by 4-3, and the case came back. Now the DOT was stuck with a piece of land they could not condemn. They couldn't build anything on it because I had put a restraining order on them to do anything with the property. And so for 2 years, nothing happened. And then the DOT started to work in the legislature to create a new statute, a so-called public property commission for the purpose of condemning other public property. The commission had no rules. It had members consisted of the Secretary of State, the governor, the lieutenant governor, and 2 or 3 other elected public officials. They didn't have any rules about due process or anything about anyone challenging whether such a condemnation should be done. And they put this thing together, and it came before me. And I looked at it, and I really started to have problems with it, but before I could do that, I wanted to try to get the people to settle the case. So I ordered the parties into mediation. Nobody wanted to go to mediation, certainly not the AG at that particular point, the Attorney General. And then secondly, I made a comment, probably an improper comment I should have never said. I said, because I really wanted them to talk about trying to resolve the case. And then I looked at him and I said, at the end of a hearing, I said, look, the Somalians and I don't know who the other one, the Eritreans, are negotiating a war that they've fought for 15 years. And they're trying to mediate, they're doing mediation and trying to work it out. And I can't get you people here around Druid Hills to mediate the case. I wonder who's civilized. Well, TOT took umbrage at that. And so when they went up to challenge my order of mediation, they also challenged me as being, I should recuse myself of being biased against the Presidential Parkway. Well, it went up to the Supreme Court and it kind of laughed off the recusal. But they did make a decision about the mediation. They said I couldn't order them to settle the case, but I could order them to mediate. And so the case was sent back. And this time, they sat down and talked for a few minutes, and that was it. And then I took the case under advisement as to whether or not that law should be upheld, the one involving the new Public Service Commission. I looked at it, and I found it defective all over the place as far as due process is concerned. You can't take real property without due process of law. It's in the 5th Amendment of the United States Constitution. I said you couldn't do it with this device. There's no opportunity for a hearing. So it went up to the Supreme Court. And this time, the Supreme Court reversed me. And so now the case is ready to go to trial. But surprisingly, when the case got back, and I looked at him and I told him, okay, we're going to go to trial on this thing. You have to tell me if you want a jury trial on it or what. And then they said, wait a minute, Judge, I think we'd like to talk. I said, you do? Yeah, and we need a mediator. And so I said, let me see what I can do. And I talked to the Neighborhood Justice Center, and they recommended somebody. I wanted somebody from out of state, because I didn't want anybody who could even be impugned of having anything to do on one side or the other of this case. And I found a fellow by the name of Michael Keating. He was a mediator out of Rhode Island. And he came down, and he started to mediate the case. And then this went on for about a couple months, and they were making progress. And then one day, Mr. Keating called me up and said he'd like to see me in chambers, and so he came over. They adjourned for the day of the mediation. And he said to me, Judge, the parties are very close to settling this case, but they can't get over that last hump. And they're going to come in here and ask you to continue the case so that we won't have to go to trial if we don't mediate the case a week from Tuesday. And I said, well, why shouldn't I grant the continuance? He says, because you've got to keep the pressure on them. They are on the verge of settling the case, so please don't continue the case. I said, all right. The parties came in and they made their motion in open court. I denied the motion. You guys are going either settling this case or you're going to trial a week from Tuesday, the day after Labor Day. It was a public ruling, and again, I got chastised by the papers. In fact, I think the Atlanta Journal editorial page said, as they said many other times, maybe it was time to replace the judge. So what can I say? And so anyway, they went back, and then 3 days later, they came into my office, all the parties, and said, Your Honor, we have settled the case. And it was over. They then built the Presidential Parkway as we know it today, making that huge park, and of course the Carter Presidential Library is one of the best in the country. It's amazing. Well, all I can say is that I've been lucky to serve as a judge on the Superior Court and the State Court for now 32 years, and I just got reelected. So you're going to have to put up with me for at least 4 more years if I don't decide to retire. I don't want to retire exactly, but I am getting a little tired. I am 71 years old. But I still like the job, and I still love this county. I love the people in the county. The county has gone through monumental changes over the years, but the quality of the people here has not changed. They are all wonderful people, and I've been honored to serve them and to serve the bar. And now I've made amends with the Bar Association after 30-some years. We get along very, very well. So I'm hoping I will have the opportunity to serve longer. And I want to thank you, because I hope some of you voted for me. But if you didn't, thank you for being here today. Thank you.